Settle down, students. Let us jump ahead in our timeline a few centuries and to another continent. Today, we will discuss the South American continent, also known as Mesoamerica. For purposes of convenience, I'm including the Inca culture, the Aztec culture, the Mayan culture, and so on, as there is little difference to their use of magic over thousands of years. Evidence shows that the ancient Mesoamericans understood all too well that life feeds on life. Unfortunately, they believe this mantra to include human life, used in sacrifice to feed their hungry gods. Many residents were honored with the opportunity to sacrifice their life in order to appease the gods. And most of the time, this was the best the gods got. Modern labels classify these cultures by categorical names. But in reality, every city carved out of the jungle was its own tribe with its own kings, leaders, priests, population, and so on. If there was trade between the tribes, there is little evidence of it, since every city had access to the same resources. There is evidence to suggest raiding parties, stealing humans, livestock, food resources, and so on. This seemed to create bragging rights over another neighboring city. The better influence your city had over its territory, the better its generosity from the gods. There is substantial data by the way of bas-relief carvings on the walls of sporting arenas that indicate a rich tradition of cross-tribe sporting events. There is also evidence of a sport resembling European football, but with a very different losing decree. Apparently, the losing team, or possible just the captain, would be ritually sacrificed on the altar of the winners. This also increased or decreased a city's influence. All of the daily comings and goings of the city and its people were ruled by the gods, and the realm of the gods was the sky and all things that inhabit it. Elaborate calendars were worked and created to track the cycles of the moon and planets. Even the buildings in the cities were placed to align with the stars and therefore the gods, to keep the magic contained therein under constant observation. Professor Sinistra will have more on this in your second year. People born on certain days, under certain conditions, or during certain astrological events, were imbued with the magic available on that fateful day. Signs could be interpreted as good or bad, and therefore, by association, so was the child born under those signs. Hence, the Mesoamerican career choice was dictated by magical practices and supported through their life by the magic of humankind. For illumination, we have an example. The day one sign under the sign Huon, with rain, states that if a child was born a noble on this day, they became a sorcerer and could change themselves into a wild beast. If born a commoner, a turkey, a dog, or a weasel. Most Mesoamerican magic was tied in closely with animals. At first, magic was only used by the gods, and they were cruel gods indeed. The most common ailments to daily life were disease, famine, plague, and so on. So offerings to the gods were meant to keep the cities free of these afflictions. These ritual killings were performed by the most powerful wizard, usually the king, on top of a temple in front of the crowd of villagers. Sometimes these were at the culmination of a festival or astronomical event. Other times, they were special events, like when a city captured a neighboring king during a raid. These leaders were the most prized as they were the practitioners of the magic rituals. To sacrifice a neighboring king would bring great protection from the gods and better status to the city. There were always healers and shaman who held the power of life and death over the sick, but the king had sway over the elements and the fates. A king could supposedly control forces of order or chaos. The distinction of good versus evil was not a concept for these ancients. A king would make offerings to the god to control the malevolent winds or the coming of disease on the wind. He could also make sacrifices for the good harvest or hunt. As a result of this, if a city was not prosperous, the populace would offer their king to a neighboring city who, by cutting off his head, would inherit his poor abilities and, by way of association, be cursed with his blood. In this fashion, if a king was found to be a fake, a charlatan, a new leader would be supported by the populace and would rise to take his place. Eventually, the leaders and kings were able to control the magic. Leaders had limited or lesser magic, being able to only affect the day-to-day management of the affairs of government. Usually, rivers, food supply, and building brave warriors were the main recipients of their magic. These leaders were held to the same standard as anyone else. If they did good, they lived. If they did not, they were sacrificed to the gods. The real magic was always in the hands of the healers. Physicians were known as tsitio, whereas a good physician was a diagnostician who restored people's health, set bones, stitched them up, and revived them, and so on. The bad physician was a fraud who killed with his medicines, worsened sickness, and so on, and was known to be a sorcerer or soothsayer. The good soothsayer read the day signs, examined and remembered, while the bad soothsayer deceived, mocked, and was a diabolical hypocrite. If you want to learn the spells and potions these ancients used, you have to ask Professors Sprout or Slughorn about them. This is where Professor Kaluta from Koldolfstrez and I disagree. I have documentation that shows that there was another type of magic practitioner, the spy. The spy had the ability to sow discontent and unrest in neighboring cities. They usually did this by transfiguring themselves into an animal form. These practitioners were mastered long before lycanthropy came to Europe. As animals able to roam freely in the opposing city, they could learn the names of influential people and pass that information on to their native city. By day, these spies infiltrated the ranks of the wise men, counselors, or persons of trust, who were serious, respected, and revered. They could also establish themselves as sorcerers, caretakers, men of discretion, guardians, and so on. They were astute, keen, careful, helpful, and they would never harm anyone, and so gained their trust. The bad spy or sorcerer was the doer of wickedness. He was an enchanter. They bewitched women, deranged and deluded people. They cast spells over the opposing citizens. They charmed them. They enchant them. They caused them to be possessed. They deceived people and confound them. Both methods were effective in destabilizing a neighboring city's status. Just to reiterate, each city status was determined by many factors, including a superior king, regular recognition of the gods through sacrifice, and a winning sports team. The city status, also an indicator as to the health of the city, and by association, its strength in magic. What should be obvious by now is that Mesoamerican communities were close-knit, loyal to their own citizens, and governed by the whim of the gods. What can we take away from today's lesson is that Mesoamericans developed blood magic as their primary focus. Fresh blood was used in many of their healing practices, religious ceremonies, a key element in any magical enchantment, and so on. Genealogical blood was responsible for carrying on the inherent family magic, mainly animal shape shifting. Although the Mesoamericans relied heavily on astrology, they inherited their ability to map the progress of the heavens from other cultures, possibly even Egyptian. All these early cultures I will be talking about had a rudimentary system for the heavens that developed, each in their own way, to include building specifically placed to mark major milestones in the movement of the stars. Give credit where credit is due. More on this subject when I get to the Persians. For your preparatory work this week, read Mesoamerican Classic Heritage from Teotihuacan, the Aztecs, by Lindsay Jones. Look for the 1656 version in the library. It looks like this. There is only one copy, so be prepared to share it. I expect a roll of parchment about a subject of your choice pertaining to Mesoamerican magic not covered in today's lecture. Due a week from today. If you find time to peruse the I Ching book of changes, you will get insights into your next lesson. You are excused.